go, let's go, let's go!
Allora, dov'è che non stiamo andando benissimo? Non stiamo andando benissimo. Quando c'è la pressione sulla palla, non deve uscire più, bisogna marcare di anticipo gli altri. Abbiamo fatto molta pressione, bravo Miracolo, e bravo anche Jeffrey, molta pressione sulla palla, però poi non deve, gli altri devono essere anticipati, onesti, devono essere anticipati, perché altrimenti si vanifica il lavoro forte che fa lui. Comunque stiamo andando bene, continuiamo così. Allora ragazzi, vi è piaciuta la partita? Allora volevo dirvi due cose, oneste, perché spesso io dico sempre le cose negative, bisogna anche però dire le cose positive. Mi avete sorpreso veramente positivamente, perché non giocare da 16 mesi e mettere a un certo punto anche l'energia giusta, la mentalità giusta, per portare anche a vincere una partita che è molto forte, molto dura, non era semplice. Ho visto in qualcuno di voi che ha fatto veramente una ottima partita, Star veramente oggi ha fatto un primo tempo che non ha mai la miglior partita, diciamo, parziale di partita l'ha fatta della tua vita questa qua. Ci siamo? Sì! 1, 2, 3! Go! Grazie ragazzi. Io sono sicuro che Tam Tam, lo vedo ogni giorno, Tam Tam ha avuto un impatto fortissimo su questi ragazzi. Gli ha cambiato totalmente la vita da quando loro hanno iniziato a giocare a basket. Avevano bisogno di qualcosa, di un sogno, e gli è stato dato come sogno il basket e non se la sono lasciati sfuggire.
Tam Tam per me è un grande sogno. Cioè, non è una cosa che è sbucata dal nulla, perché non te l'aspetti. Cioè, non aspetti che qualcuno ti dia queste cose. Cioè, ad esempio, che ti dia un canestro a casa, che ti porta dei palloni. Molte altre società di basket te le compri tu da solo. Non sono loro che ti danno queste cose.
Il mio sogno è arrivare prima in NBA e poi dopo giocare anche per la nazionale italiana. Sarà difficile, però ce la farò. Credo che ce la farò. Secondo me il paese sarà fiero, molto molto fiero. Perché è bello vedere un ragazzo di colore che prima non poteva giocare e poi è andato in nazionale italiana, cioè è molto bello per me. Credo anche per tutti. Cioè.
Money laundering, corruption, vast losses and embezzlement.
They smuggled that money, of course with the knowledge of our high offices in the land.
Al Jazeera World tells the story of the near billion-dollar collapse of Kabul Bank in 2010.
Where are these people? How come they were never questioned? How come I was never questioned?
Questions that hung over Afghanistan for the next decade and beyond. The Kabul Bank crash on Al Jazeera.
A word or two about the Gulf states. With that light breeze coming out of the northwest, humidity is not a great thing at the moment, but the temperature's still on the high side of normal, shall we say. Generally speaking, it's dry, but there's a hint of the change further west. Look at this. Showers breaking out in the northwest of Saudi, in Jordan, in Egypt. Now, that is part of a change that will come out of Eastern Europe eventually. To the south of that, Salala's in the sunshine now. No hint of any drizzle or overcast conditions. That's completely disappeared. So a concentration on what's happening here. Do you remember that flooding the other day in Cyprus? That's a potential with that developing massive showers. All part of the system you can stretch across Iraq, which is probably welcome, a bit of a cooling trend, and this rain that's showing up in Baku. Temperatures have come down in the stands as well. Tashkent, though, is still at about 13 degrees. Now, we talked specifically about Nigeria yesterday, and it's still in the forecast. Heavy rain around the coast of Nigeria and back through Ghana, and as far north as the Gambia, which is unusually late rain. But it is all moving slowly south, so it'll be places like Cameroon and the Gambia where the heaviest rain will fall in the next day or so, which is as it should be, but it's still causing flooding.
On November the 8th, Americans will vote all the seats in the House of Representatives, and 35% of the Senate will be contested. Americans are expected to split on strict ideological lines, with abortion and the economy named as the key issues. The results will define the rest of Joe Biden's presidency and put America's democratic principles to the test. Special coverage of the midterm elections on Al Jazeera.
Inmates. Learning from other inmates. Acquiring knowledge that could set them free. Through legal education classes and mock tribunals, their dedication has led to staggering results.
He's been in prison for 15 years. It is of recent that I was set free.
Teaching Empowerment, Kenya, part of the Rebel Education series on Al Jazeera.
bold journalism.
The police violently dispersing protesters. You can hear.
These are some of the tens of thousands of people trying to flee Kabul.
Inspired programme making.
Welcome to Generation Change.
Unrivaled broadcasting.
White people did not want black children in their schools.
We have to fight for justice and peace.
Al Jazeera English, proud recipient of the New York Festival's Broadcaster of the Year Award for the 6th year running.
Palestinians mourn the deaths of 6 people killed by Israeli forces. A prominent leader of the Lion's Den armed group is among the dead. I'm Rob Matheson. This is Al Jazeera live from Doha. Also coming up, Rishi Sunak is set to take over as Britain's youngest Prime Minister after the current leader, Liz Truss, steps down in the next few hours. A powerful cyclone hits Bangladesh, killing at least 9 people, destroying homes and disrupting lives. And Qatar is pledging to host the first carbon-neutral Football World Cup. We're going to take a look at the challenges facing the tiny Gulf nation. Six Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces in the occupied West Bank. The Israeli military entered Nablus on Monday night, sparking protests. At least 5 people were killed in the city. Another was killed near Ramallah. Among the dead is a prominent leader of the armed group called Lion's Den. The group's claimed responsibility for a number of recent attacks on illegal settlements and military checkpoints in the West Bank. I'm joined now by correspondent Nida Ibrahim, who's on the phone for us. Nida, what more do we know about this latest event?
We know that a special Israeli force has entered Nablus in the early hours of the morning after midnight, and there has been an armed confrontation between that special Israeli force and members of security forces from the Palestinian Authority, leading to more reinforcements from the Israeli side to the city. And we know that there was an attack against an Israeli raid against one car. We're still getting the details of what happened, but it ended up killing 3 Palestinians and injuring more. In the end, Palestinians they managed to evacuate some of those who were stuck in the old city in Nablus, and the result is that 6 Palestinians were killed, including Wadia Al-Hawah, who is a leader in the Lion's Den group. This group has been becoming more and more prominent in the occupied West Bank. People have been praising members of the group for being courageous, for fighting the Israeli occupation. And we've seen scenes where Palestinians were trying to bring the body of Al-Hawah from the hospital, hoping that he was still alive. They were celebrating, and moments later he was announced dead. We're expecting 6 funerals. This is a tense situation in the occupied West Bank, and people say that because Israel is heading towards an election and there is a leader now in the office, Yair Lapid, the current prime minister, who doesn't have a lot of military experience in the West Bank. So the feeling here amongst Palestinians is that he's trying to win more votes by cracking down heavily on Palestinians.
Nida, thank you very much indeed. That's Nida Ibrahim bringing us up to date. Okay, let's take a closer look at what we know about the Lion's Den. Members of the armed group first appeared in public in Nablus in the occupied West Bank last month. They recited what they called a charter of resistance during a memorial service for 2 Palestinians killed by Israeli forces. Since then, the Lion's Den has claimed responsibility for a number of attacks on military checkpoints and illegal settlements in Nablus. Ibrahim Yunus is media coordinator for the Palestinian Youth Movement. He says the Lion's Den armed group has emerged in response to Israeli attacks against young Palestinians.
To understand the perspective of Palestinian youth in the West Bank, you have to look at a situation where there's 800,000 settlers who are illegally occupying a great percentage of the land there. You have constant daily attacks on Palestinian youth who are, whether they're crossing checkpoints, whether they're walking to school or to work. The number of young Palestinians run over by cars or attacked by settlers is large. So obviously there's going to be a lot of popularity among youth in the West Bank when a group says that they're not going to accept the presence of these settlers on their land. They emerged out of a group of youth who defend the city, essentially, from Israeli incursions, and decided to create a more formal group that would defend the city, which is where the group name and organizational structure sort of emerged. They do not have a working relationship with the Palestinian Authority. So the Palestinian Authority at the higher levels collaborates with or coordinates security with Israel, and the Lion's Den does not. So they do not have a formal relationship.
Britain is set to get its youngest prime minister in modern history and the first of Asian heritage. Rishi Sunak will succeed Liz Truss as leader in the coming hours. Sunak lost to Truss over the summer in a race to become the Conservative Party leader. However, following her resignation last week, Sunak was the only candidate to get past the threshold of 100 votes in a ballot of Conservative MPs. Well, Andrew Symonds is in London and is joining us now. Andrew, these transfers of power are very very carefully choreographed. Just talk us through what's going to happen.
Well, this is the third Prime Minister in a matter of 50 days. So the British public is getting quite used to this procedure. It all starts in Downing Street, 10 Downing Street, with Liz Truss, the outgoing Prime Minister, the shortest-serving Prime Minister in British political history. She will assemble the cabinet for the last farewell. It will be brief. She will say goodbye to the staff also, and then appear. It's expected she'll appear here in Downing Street at the lectern to make a speech. That'll be probably quite brief. She will then go to Buckingham Palace, where King Charles III is expecting an audience with her, and she will formally resign from the government. She's already resigned as Prime Minister with a notice that she would stay in place until her replacement was found. That will be a fairly brief affair following protocol. She will then leave, and then Rishi Sunak, the man who she'd beaten in the election challenge for leadership over the summer with the membership of the Conservative Party, but he was the choice of the Parliamentary Party. And now it's all coming to fruition for him. He will be going to meet King Charles and receive an invitation to form a government, which he will certainly be doing in a fairly rapid way. He will leave and he will come here to Downing Street in something like, well, it's going to be about 2 to 3 hours, probably nearer 3, and he will then address the nation. We've not heard a lot from him. This has been a most extraordinary leadership election. Not one vote has been cast. He was only the only contender who got through the threshold of 100 nominations.
The fact that you're raising the fact that we haven't actually heard a lot from him, that is something that is resonating with a lot of people, isn't it? Because there's a lot of speculation about how he's going to be handling the situation that the country is finding itself in the moment, not least with the fact that the economy is struggling. People are finding it very difficult to pay for their groceries. A lot of people can't find jobs. He's going to be looked at to see what he's going to do about those problems.
Colossal pressure, compounded by the fiasco of government this past 2 months. He has, from the very get-go in trying to get the Prime Minister's job, put the economy to the fore. So that's in his favour. He's also more or less predicted that Truss would have a catastrophe with the economy because she was using what he termed during a TV debate fantasy economics, in fact fairy tale economics as well. He was basically saying that there had to be a really hard look at cutbacks in many areas, not just that story of trying to have tax cuts. So what is the background? Well, he is technically right now he has to form the government and then actually get the midterm fiscal report out. That's due on the 31st, that's next Monday. That's very tight. They've already given a report, most of the information and the actual acts of that. Jeremy Hunt, the acting finance minister, well, not acting, actually formal finance minister right now, but certainly he took over from Liz Truss, more or less, in terms of saving the economy from being monstered by the markets with absolutely big crisis. So that's the big issue he's got. The Office of Budget Responsibility is going through all of the information in that. He may have to try to extend that period by about 3 or 4 days ahead of the Bank of England meeting and possibly putting up interest rates again. So there's a lot of things to do. He is aware of the crisis. The Office for National Statistics has given a grim picture of the cost of living, saying that between June and September it became much, much more of a problem, particularly for ethnic minorities and particularly for disabled people. Red light going there. Green light going on at Downing Street, and a new Prime Minister who warns quite simply that the unity of the party is key. He said, unite or die. It's a grim mantra, but it's one he's sticking to.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed. Andrew Simmons talking to us from London. Cyclone Sitrang has made landfall in Bangladesh, bringing high winds and heavy storm surges. At least 9 people have been killed. Officials fear the toll is going to rise because it hit at the low-lying, densely populated Chittagong Barisal coast. Hundreds of thousands of people have already been evacuated in large cities like Dhaka. Scientists say climate change will increase the risk of extreme weather events in the Bay of Bengal. Tanvir Chaudhry's got more from Bangladesh's Barisal district.
We are located about 30 kilometers from the coastline. This is Borishal district, southwest Bangladesh. These are the area which got main thrust of the cyclone. Now, while coming here from the Dhaka city, we see a lot of fallen trees. Not much damage compared to what was expected. I spoke to a lot of our contacts in different coastal areas. They said there's been a tidal surge. A lot of the places were inundated. A lot of farmland got destroyed. Fisheries got destroyed. But as far as damage to the homes were minimum, government were successfully able to evacuate nearly 700,000 people since last evening in the cyclone shelter. So the damage was minimum. As you said, there was, so far what we know is 9 people were killed. That's what the local media is also reported. Now the damage assessment report will take time to reach to the media as well as other people, because the communication is very badly disrupted. There's no electricity in the entire southwest belt, even in this Borishal city. We've been talking to people, they said we didn't have electricity since yesterday evening. This comes in a time when there is an energy crisis here. Electricity goes off for 6 hours to 8 hours a day in some parts of the country. So the internet and communication is badly disrupted. Even the mobile telephone system is badly disrupted. So it will take some time to know the exact damage. We know that it hit the coastline at 80 kilometers an hour. So there probably is in the remote islands and other coastal belt, we'll hear for more damage. What's more important to know that usually after the cyclone, it's the crops, the fisheries, the livestock that are the biggest problem that the farmers lose, and it takes years, to recover from this.
Still ahead on Al Jazeera, thousands gathered in Bosnia-Herzegovina to protest against changes to electoral rules. UNICEF issues an urgent warning following a cholera outbreak in 2 countries in the Middle East.
Now, the weather should be changing, going towards winter at the moment, but you would not think so, given that the weather's coming at the moment from the southwest, which is not a cold direction. And so what was cold in Scandinavia, freezing in fact, is rapidly being pushed out of the way once again. So although we saw temperatures right down below normal over the weekend, it's going up. 8 in Oslo will go up to double figures come Wednesday. The real cold is pushed back in Finland and held in St. Petersburg. Everything else covered in cloud and lightish rain. It's on the mild side of normal. Even more so where the sun is out, which is the case in most of Spain, the central part of the Mediterranean, across towards the Balkans, the rain disappearing from Italy and Slovenia. So conveniently, most places in mainland Europe are about 7 degrees above average temperature-wise, and they're not going down anytime soon, not significantly. Now, in North Africa, the anomaly here is more the rainfall than the temperatures. It's still raining on and off as far north as the Gambia. Now, Banjul's had about 140% so far of its monthly rainfall, so any more is just icing on the cake. And it's still raining heavily in Ghana and southern Nigeria, where, of course, there are floods.
You're watching Al Jazeera. A reminder of our top stories this hour. At least 6 Palestinians have been killed and 21 wounded after Israeli forces raided several areas in the occupied West Bank. Israel said it launched an operation against the Palestinian armed group, the Lion's Den. Rishi Sunak is set to officially succeed Liz Truss as the UK's Prime Minister in the coming hours. At age 42, Sunak is going to be the youngest British leader in modern history. Cyclone Citrine has made landfall in Bangladesh, bringing high winds and heavy storm surges. At least 9 people have been killed, and officials fear the toll is going to rise. Thousands of people gathered in Bosnia-Herzegovina's capital, Sarajevo, on Monday to condemn changes to the country's electoral laws. The changes were imposed by the international peace envoy, Christian Schmidt. He said they're meant to prevent blockades of regional governments following general elections this month. But critics of Schmidt called his decision an illiberal power grab. The rally comes 2 days after the Election Commission confirmed the majority of nationalist parties in Parliament. Yasmin Mujinvec is a political scientist. He explains why so many people took to the streets in anger.
There's 2 primary reasons. One concerns the fashion in which the electoral law was changed, which was on October 2nd, so a couple of weeks ago, minutes after the polls had closed. So Christian Schmidt, the High Representative, amended Bosnia's election laws, or rather the election laws in the federation entity, literally as votes were being counted. Bosnians had voted under one system, and then their votes were going to be tabulated under another system. And the second major reason is that the actual content of his changes, most folks fear, will have a kind of ethnic gerrymandering effect, in that they will disproportionately benefit not actually one community, but one specific ethno-nationalist bloc, the main Croat nationalist party in the country, the HDZ. Christian Schmidt, as High Representative, has these so-called bond powers, which are these fiat powers which grant him really a really large executive mandate to amend Bosnia's laws unilaterally, to amend its constitutions unilaterally, to even sack publicly elected officials. But usually those powers have been used through great consultation with international partners and indeed local leaders as well. Christian Schmidt attempted to amend Bosnia's electoral laws in the federation in July, and that prompted large-scale public protests. He was condemned by international legislators and also the U.S. Helsinki Commission, among others. He knew this was going to be unpopular. He knew that there was a cloud of illegitimacy surrounding these moves, and then to have actually sort of pulled the proverbial trigger as votes were literally being counted on election day itself was I think, especially galling to a whole host of people.
The U.S. Justice Department says it's charged 2 suspected Chinese intelligence officers. Washington says they were involved in an alleged plot to disrupt a federal probe into the Chinese tech giant Huawei. The Justice Department separately announced charges against 4 other Chinese nationals. It's accusing them of trying to get hold of sensitive technology using the cover of an academic institute. Ali Jo Castro has more from Washington, D.C.
These two Chinese agents tried to bribe a U.S. law enforcement official into giving up sensitive and secret documents regarding the U.S.'s legal strategy in its prosecution of Huawei. But that, in fact, this U.S. government official was a double agent who was working under the direction of FBI and feeding these alleged Chinese spies fake documents. There were also other cases they mentioned. Another case in New Jersey where 7 Chinese nationals were charged with trying to forcibly repatriate and harass a naturalized U.S. citizen into returning to China. 2 of those that have been charged in that case have been arrested. But a big question is how the U.S. will arrest the remaining individuals who were charged if they are no longer in the U.S. or have been conducting this from China this whole time. Bigger picture here now. Again, I said that this was announced by the 2 top law enforcement officers in the U.S., the FBI director and the attorney general. And they had strong words about what they call the backdrop of maligned activity from China, described as espionage, harassment, obstruction of justice, and the stealing of technology.
Germany is expected to host a conference on rebuilding Ukraine after Russia's invasion. In the early days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Irpin became a symbol of the resistance. Now, as Mohammad Jamjoom reports, reconstruction efforts are underway to bring life back to the heavily damaged city.
Here in Irpin, which sits just outside Kyiv and stands as a symbol of Ukrainian resistance, you can still very clearly see the massive levels of devastation that this war has brought upon this country. It's been months since Russian forces withdrew from this city, and yet apartment complexes like this one still lie in ruin. That's because government money is largely going to the military right now. And it's also why residents' associations here are putting up signs on the sides of buildings asking for donations and providing bank details for those who wish to donate.
If we find funding by spring or summer, we could begin rebuilding our house, and by 2024 we would likely come back here to live.
The cost of repairing the damage to Ukraine's infrastructure has been estimated by the Kyiv School of Economics to be nearly $200 billion. Now, local officials here and throughout the country have been appealing to the international community for help in their reconstruction efforts. Here in Irpin, people are still living in less damaged buildings like this one. In this city, there were more than 1,000 buildings that were damaged and more than 100 that were destroyed completely as a result of the fighting.
We come back because we wanted to be in our home. Thanks to the authorities, we are slowly getting prepared, and we're trying to live, and we hope everything will be rebuilt soon.
There is a problem. We don't have enough building materials needed to finish the work. That's why we're asking charitable organizations for more help and supplies.
Many throughout Ukraine are doing what they can to aid in the reconstruction effort. But with fast approaching, temperatures dropping, and Russia targeting more of the country's power grid, Ukrainians are growing ever more concerned.
Watchdog is preparing to send inspectors to Ukraine. They've been invited by Kyiv to examine facilities after Russia accused Ukraine of planning to use explosives laced with nuclear material. Well, Harry Fawcett's joining us live now from Kyiv. It looks as though Ukraine is anxious to try to lay any suspicions to rest, but one wonders what the IAEA inspectors are actually going to be able to look at.
Well, they say they're going to come in the next few days and look at 2 Ukrainian nuclear facilities, facilities that it's believed the head of the nuclear biological military department was talking about in his conference on Monday, when he said that work at these places had been instructed and was in its final stages in the preparation of a dirty bomb. That's something that's entirely denied here in Kiev. Politicians here are talking about Russia having a track record of accusing other people of measures that it intends to take itself. And so the head of the IAEA, Rafael Grossi, is saying that they will come, these inspectors, in the next couple of days, that one of the facilities in question was inspected just a month ago, and Ukraine was found to be complying with all nuclear safeguarding, that no unusual activity had been found at this facility itself. I spoke to one senior member of the National Institute for Security Studies here, a senior defense analyst. He was saying that if Russia itself intended to do something along these lines, there was only one place it could really get such material. That is the power station that it controls, Zaporizhia, whether it might be able to get some spent nuclear fuel rods from there and use those in a dirty bomb. But he said even that would be difficult, given that there is an IAEA presence even at that power station. His surmise, his analysis of the situation was more that Russia was using this as rhetoric to try to indicate that it was willing to escalate if necessary, that it was going to continue fighting this war, even in the face of what have been major setbacks on the battlefield in recent days and weeks. And when it comes to Zaporizhia, of course, that is now not part of the Ukrainian power grid. There are all sorts of attacks continuing on the energy sector here. The government's latest measure is that it's going to reduce the amount of consumption by industry.
Harry, thank you very much indeed. Harry Fawcett bringing us up to date from Kyiv. Lebanon is warning that a cholera outbreak spreading rapidly in the region. The number of infections there reached more than 200 people within 2 weeks, especially among Syrian refugees at the camps. Zena Khadr reports from Beirut.
Cholera in Syria is fast spreading. Thousands are being treated for the highly contagious disease that transmits through contaminated water and food. The outbreak was declared in September. Since then, more than 70 people have died. Thousands more are being treated.
This is Hassan, my son. He is sick and has severe vomiting and diarrhea. I brought him to the center. My son's blood pressure had dropped considerably and he was very tired. But after a day or two, his condition has improved a lot, thank God.
Access to health services and clean water is hard in a country devastated by years of war. International and local NGOs are doing their best to respond to the crisis, but they complain of the lack of medications, vaccines, as well as water treatment materials. The situation is not any different in neighboring Lebanon, where the disease was detected a month after the outbreak in Syria.
There is the issue of cholera vaccine. We are asking the international community to help bring the vaccine to Lebanon. Unfortunately, there is a shortage because there are many outbreaks across the world.
Until then, there are efforts to contain the outbreak. Water in Lebanon was already unsafe to drink without treatment. But the nearly bankrupt state doesn't have enough fuel to run water stations.
We are very scared. We are old and frail. And the problem is that we can't even afford to buy bottled water.
The World Health Organization says sewage water testing indicates cholera has spread to regions far from the initial cases. The vulnerable are already at risk. In Lebanon, that means Syrian refugees living in camps where the ground is fertile for the spread of the disease.
Once I saw my child drinking water from the well. It is dirty water. Sewage goes in there.
So far, officials here are downplaying the general contamination of water networks that supply millions of people. But experts say the risk is there. Zena Khadr, Al Jazeera, Beirut.
More than 1 million football fans are preparing for their trip to Qatar, with the World Cup just 26 days away. The environmental impact of that many travellers is expected to be huge. But organisers are confident they're going to deliver the first carbon-neutral tournament. Natasha Khanem reports.
Carbon dioxide, or CO2 emissions, soared to a record level last year. By several indexes, Qatar ranks high globally when it comes to CO2 emissions per capita. This November, the Gulf nation is pledging to host the first ever carbon-neutral World Cup.
A lot of people will come to the Qatar by air,
but the activities here within Qatar is designed in such a way that all the emissions associated, there will be limited emissions, and these emissions will be balanced.
The layout of stadiums over a small geographic area means once fans land in Qatar, they'll travel a relatively short distance by metro, electric bus, or car to matches in stadiums built with sustainability in mind. After football's premier spectacle is over, the CO2 emissions during the 28 days will be offset by investing in carbon credits. But a report by Carbon Market Watch says Qatar 2022's carbon neutral plan is misleading and based on what it calls creative calculations.
It is highly unlikely that this World Cup is going to be carbon neutral. It is not a credible claim, and there is a big risk that it's going to mislead the public into thinking that this has no impact on the climate when actually it definitely does.
The organizing committee says Qatar's historic ambitions should be recognized, not criticized. It points to the almost 1 million square meters of green space created and a new solar power plant that will generate renewable energy for years after the tournament ends.
We stand by our planning, we stand by our calculations, and we stand by our plans to offset what's remaining in the best possible way with the best information that we have.
A team from Qatar University will be setting up weather monitoring stations and sharing the daily air quality with fans during the World Cup. The hope is it will spread awareness about the impact we have on the climate and how to reduce our carbon footprint. Natasha Ghanem, Al Jazeera, Doha.
This is Al Jazeera. These are the top stories. At least 6 Palestinians have been killed and 21 have been wounded after Israeli forces raided several areas in the occupied West Bank. Israel said it launched an operation against the Palestinian armed group, the Lion's Den. Nida Ibrahim's following developments from Hawara in the occupied West Bank.
There has been an armed confrontation between that special Israeli force and members of security forces from the Palestinian Authority, leading to more reinforcements from the Israeli side to the city. And we know that there was an attack against an Israeli raid against one car. We're still getting the details of what happened, but it ended up killing 3 Palestinians and injuring more.
Britain set to get its youngest prime minister in modern history and the first of Asian heritage. Rishi Sunak's going to succeed Liz Truss as leader in the coming hours. Sunak lost to Truss over the summer in a race to become the Conservative Party leader. However, following her resignation last week, Sunak was the only candidate to pass the threshold of 100 votes in a ballot of Conservative MPs. Cyclone Sitrang has made landfall in Bangladesh, bringing high winds and heavy storm surges. At least 9 people have been killed, and officials fear the toll is going to rise. The UN's nuclear watchdog is preparing to send inspectors to Ukraine. They've been invited by Kyiv to examine facilities after Russia accused Ukraine of planning to use explosives laced with nuclear material. The U.S. Justice Department says it's disrupted criminal activity by people working for the Chinese government. 2 suspected Chinese intelligence officers are being charged with attempting to obstruct an American criminal investigation into Chinese tech giant Huawei. Those are the headlines. The news continues on Al Jazeera after Inside Story. Goodbye.
Brazil's presidential election is going to a second round on October 30th. Incumbent hardline President Jair Bolsonaro and former socialist President Lula da Silva are vying for votes. But which one will voters choose to re-elect to Brazil's highest office? Ongoing special coverage on Al Jazeera.
At least 220 people have been killed in the latest fighting in Sudan. It has created more turmoil a year after a military takeover scuttled the transition to civilian rule. So what can bring stability to Sudan? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. The south of Sudan has seen some of the worst violence between rival ethnic communities in months. At least 220 people have been killed in the past week. Security forces have been deployed to calm the situation in Blue Nile State near the border with Ethiopia. The Hausa and Berta tribes have been fighting since July for access to land and resources. Witnesses reported heavy gunfire and homes burned to the ground. International aid agencies are urging all sides to allow them to enter the region. The fighting has triggered protests in the state capital, calling for the governor to be sacked. The UN says at least 1,200 people have been displaced.
These displaced are now in schools as large groups. These habitats are not fit to be camps. It doesn't have the proper health conditions. There are a lot of complications and we can't handle the situation because the flow of displaced is still ongoing. That is why we are calling on aid organizations and friendly countries and the federal government to send the necessary aid.
Well, the ethnic violence has created more instability in Sudan a year after the military takeover. Soldiers shot dead an anti-coup protester in the capital, Khartoum, on Sunday. There have been protests throughout Sudan since Army Chief Abdel Fattah al-Burhan seized power in October last year and ousted a civilian-led government. Talks on resuming the democratic transition have made little progress. Plus, the economic situation is worsening. The World Bank says inflation is at 380%. A third of Sudan's 45 million people don't have enough to eat.
We are demonstrating to make one thing clear. We don't want political compromise, partnership with the army, negotiations or a political solution. We want to overthrow the coup. And for that, we are ready to pay the price, even with our lives.
Well, let's take a brief look back at Sudan's political upheaval in the past few years, beginning in 2019. That's when a longtime leader, Omar al-Bashir, was pushed out. Then a 3-year power-sharing agreement was established with Abdullah Hamdok as Prime Minister. He served for only about a year when the military arrested him, seized power and quashed protests against the takeover. Since then, the military has expanded its powers. General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan was sworn in as head of the ruling council. Protests against military rule have been held nearly every week since October last year. Let's bring in our guests now. And in Khartoum, we have Hajooj Kuka, political activist and member of Garifna. That's a non-violent resistance movement. And in Manama, we've got Abdul Khalik Shaib. He's a Sudanese lawyer and political analyst. Very good to have both of you on the show. Thanks for joining us. Hajooj, there's a lot of instability in Sudan at the moment. It's a complicated picture. But let's start by focusing on the Blue Nile State and these extraordinary levels of violence that we're seeing at the moment. What is the situation there now?
It's horrifying. The pictures that are coming from there, the videos that are coming from there are just simply horrifying. It's really hard to look at. We've been calling our friends there, and they're just talking about how the humanitarians, the whole stability is really bad, and they need humanitarian help and whatnot. What's really complicated is because it's tribal conflicts, and these tribal conflicts are rooted in political issues and rooted in feeling that you're not heard and all of those things, but they're really being complicated. And what the government right now has, the military government, is only security measures to tackle it. And these measures definitely are not working. So right now, the people are left with fighting each other, fighting the military, like a total loss of control over the Blue Nile. And there's no solutions because the country is the only thing they have in their hands is weapons, and these are not working right now. Okay. So what's needed is civilian solutions, and the current government is unable to even start understanding the depth of the root of the problem.
Absolutely. We'll be looking a little bit more at the government in Khartoum in just a moment. For the moment, Abdul Khalik Shaib, I want to just focus a little bit more on this situation in Blue Nile, because this was a relatively calm state until July, as far as I'm aware. So why have the tensions been breaking out then and again now?
Thank you so much for having me. I mean, broadly, we need to understand that tribal conflicts in Sudan, they are not new. They are renewed every now and then because of the lack of governance in Khartoum, and this has its reflection in the region. But what we need to understand is that there has never been an inclusive process in the Blue Niles or the South Kordofan, which are basically the areas where the conflicts are now erupting. So it started in July as part of a dispute over land. It has always been disputes over land, but this again a manipulation by politicians how to use it. And also we need to understand and keep in mind that the NCPs, the National Congress Party, when they have been toppled and the fall of Bashir's regime, this has left the Sudanese with a vacuum in these areas, and each group are using that vacuum in a different way, and this creating different allies between within these groups. So we need to understand that and keep it in mind. So it was relatively calm, but not necessarily will lead to any stability if we don't see any stability in Khartoum.
Hajooj, how far do you agree with that? Because many do say that what we're seeing right now are not normal cycles of traditional violence, that they do have the added factors of being infiltrated by other Sudanese who are competing for resources and for power. Do you agree with that?
I totally agree with the other guest. I mean, basically, this level of eruption can happen in other places in Sudan. Blue Nile is shocking because they've been more peaceful, because there's less tribal conflicts in the past in Blue Nile. So it is shocking that this is happening. But it is something that we're used to in other places, parts of Sudan. And right now, because of the political situation, in the ability of the SPLA, led by Malik Agar, to actually become a real civilian government and make the people in Blue Nile feel that they're all equal. So all of these things, so the political part is definitely a big part. When the government fails to show people that they can control, they can bring justice and whatnot, people revert back to their tribes. And when you go back to your tribes, all these issues that have been building on for years come to the forefront. And that's what's happening, the inability to solve these issues. Conflict is normal. In Sudan, you're always going to have these conflicts, but you always have to have ways to solve these conflicts. And right now, there's no ways to solve these conflicts. And that's why they erupt. And when they erupt, there's no ways to hold them back.
I guess what I'm trying to get to the bottom of is whether this particular violence is erupting because it's being ignored by the military government in Khartoum or because it's being stoked by the military.
So both in the same level. It's more like they're not able to control them. So it's not that they're using them to do anything over there, but these problems are there. There's a huge economic issue because of the 1 year into the coup, the economics of the country is collapsing. There's all these issues that need to be dealt with. There's all these promises that were given after the revolution, and all of these have not been answered. So now you're just sitting there waiting for things to improve, and they're getting worse. And when they're getting worse, people are trying to solve. There's no government to talk to, so they start going back to their tribal roots, and these issues erupt. And that's more like what's happening in Blue Nile. In other parts of the country, there is more conflict because you have people like RSF and whatnot. But in Blue Nile, it's more the failure of the government to actually act or to become or be able to even address the issues that are happening in the country a year into not having a government that can run the country.
So, Abdul Khaliq, what would you say are the reasons for the government failing to act?
I think it's pretty much the political competition. I mean, Hajooj mentioned part of it. I mean, if you look at Malik Agar, he's representing the Sudanese Liberation Movement North, which is part of the Juba Peace Agreement, while Abdelaziz Al-Hilo, who's in the Nuba Mountain and heading the Sudanese also Liberation Movement, he's not part of the Juba Peace Agreement. So you could look at it from that angle. And also, this is not a conflict; it's not new. Malik Agar has been in a conflict with the government before the Juba Peace Agreement and before the 2019 Constitutional Declaration. So he's always been part of the equation in how things should unfold. So if you look at that, and then you look at how different communities they're trying to take their different positions, you would understand that it's a political fight. It's not just tribal in that sense. So if you do not find a solution to a peace, a long-lasting peace in the Blue Nile, South Kordofan, and the Nuba Mountains, you will more likely see this erupting over and over. So I think this is part of it, yeah.
Is it not that the elites, the military, Bashir affiliates, even the pro-democracy movement, they're all too busy in Khartoum focusing on getting power?
They are too busy. This is one thing, but there's also another thing. It's not there's no interest at the moment by Malik Agar to strike a peace deal in the Nuba Mountain and in the Nuba Mountain, the Blue Nile. There's no interest whatsoever to renegotiate the Juba Peace Agreement to make it meaningful for the Sudanese people, to bring peace and justice and security. So if you look at it from that perspective, and also, the elites and the intelligentsia in Khartoum, they are focusing on striking a deal, which is basically a compromise rather than a political solution driven by genuine political process. So you would understand how things are difficult now to solve in the Blue Nile.
I mean, Hajooj, rather, a lot of these problems, these tensions, they stem from access to land, don't they? The Hausa were never given indigenous land rights. They've never indeed been given Sudanese citizenship. The Juba peace deal, it was supposed to address these land rights issues. What happened there? Why did it fail to implement these policies?
Okay, I think to bring this into perspective, because it seems very complicated, there's an old Sudan. And the old Sudan is this tribal Sudan that's based on land, having all these issues. And there's this idea of a new Sudan, where it's a citizenship, where it's after post-revolution Sudan. It's a Sudan where we can become a country. Right now, when you're trying to solve the issues by having this peace agreement that is basically talking about the rights of different groups, that is historical rights, that are rights based on your ethnic group and whatnot, it also always makes you to go back to your ethnic groups. And you want to strengthen your ethnic groups so you get these rights. And this makes a conflict between the different ethnic groups. And this is why we have all these tribal conflicts, because really you get power because you're tribal, your tribal power, or because you have a rebel group and you have arms. And this is the old Sudan. So really, with the idea of the old Sudan, what happened in the Juba Agreement and all that, we cannot move forward. And you're always going to have these issues because of that. So the revolution was always about, let's become a country. Let it become part of your rights in the constitution. Let's all be equal. Let's solve all these problems, the root cause of these problems that divide all of us and make us all not have a certain identity and not be part of this one country on the same level. And this is the idea of the new Sudan, and this is the idea of the revolution. And these are the answers. So as long as you try to solve these issues, not in the roots of them, just try to solve on the surface, you're just unable to. And you're never going to get to the point of a government, and you're never going to get to the point of a country. You're never going to get to the point of ending these issues of land, these issues that are deep-rooted in where you're coming from, which year you came into this country. The Hausa, you've just been there for 150 years or 200 years, and these groups have been long. So all these issues are just historical issues that have deep-rooted issues that need to be solved. And these will never be solved by the Juba Agreement or by having these smaller ways of dealing with the problem in small bites.
Let's bring in Bakri Eljak Al-Medni. He's a visiting researcher at the Doha Institute of Graduate Studies. Good to have you with us. Hajooj was just saying that you can divide Sudan into Old Sudan and New Sudan. If we're looking at the crux of the violence that's broken out in the Blue Nile state, how can we overcome that?
First of all, thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. It's a historic moment, and it's also a sad moment in the history of the country. But to speak to your question, let me just say, it's in a post-colonial country, it's not unheard of to have a tribal conflict and ethnic conflict. That's something has been around. The difference is, in the last 30 years, I think there have been an official investment from the authority, and I mean here the Bashir regime. They invested in extreme policies of divide rule, and I have to add, in the aftermath of the coup of October 25th, 2021, there have been an even serious and severe investment in tribalizing politics, ethnic politics, and using tribes as a substitute and a proxy for gaining political power. So from that perspective, I would say Bashir played the game in a way that his regime always knew, as they did the game in Darfur. They played it in the south, in Nuba Mountain, in eastern Sudan, and in Blue Nile as well. But the difference is there used to be a unified central of command. The security apparatus used to have a control over what they were doing. They aligned with certain tribes against other tribes, and they have always had in their mind a plan. As we speak, I think the Sudanese state in its weakest point in history, I would argue there is no government of the day in the country that could say that they have control over the country. Not even the country. I don't even think they have control over the military headquarters, let alone the rest of the country. From that perspective, and I think you could go and say what's going on in Blue Nile is not something that is outside of the ordinary. The difference is now we have an official government investment in making ethnic division and actually using tribes as a way of dividing and as a way of actually using ethnic groups as a way of controlling and divide rule. It's an old trick. Divide rule, it's not something new, but it is dangerous because no one really has the ability to control how this might go. In terms of talking to old Sudan, new Sudan, I think the country is going through a transition. We are witnessing some old institutions, and I'm not talking about socioeconomic institutions that are dying. I'm talking about ethnic, tribal leadership. They don't have the ability to control the country the way they used to be, but also the new institutions that we're talking about that are becoming in place, resistance committees and other kind of political shapes and forms are far away from being materialized. We cannot really say we have
let's just jump in there because Abdul Khalik, to the extent do you believe or think that Sudan is going through a transition? We've got Abdel Fattah al-Burhan pledging to step aside for a civilian government, pledging elections. Do you think that's going to happen? Do you think we'll see the rise of the resistance committees into government?
I think this is it will and it will not happen. So basically pledging to transition, we're no longer in transition. We have a coup, basically a government, which is a de facto government in place in Khartoum. But that government is a military. We don't have a sovereignty council, which is basically a sovereignty council. The nature and the definition of sovereignty council will have civilians, which is no longer the case. Now, I think in July, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan said we need the civilians to sit together and agree on the way forward. That is unfair because he's basically saying for the pro-democracy movements to sit with the movements and the groups that supported the military. Whether this will lead to anything, the dialogue we are seeing currently in Khartoum is basically to strike a political compromise rather than solving the problem, because you have the pro-democracy movements, you have the RCs, you have those who have been not part of the coup. They are one camp, and then you have the military and those supporting the military from the political parties. They are or the Juba peace signatories. They are also another camp, and then you have those who haven't been part of the process. So I think the threat. The question would be whether if you're going to have an election, would the international community recognize and agree with the election? Will it be a fair election? Do the Sudanese, do they have the ability to go into the elections? Are the political parties ready for the elections? I think the answer to these questions are, is no. At the moment,
Hajouj, I can see you shaking your head there. Do you agree with that now is not the right time to bring elections to Sudan?
I totally agree. I totally agree that to actually get to the point where you can have elections, you need the transitional period. Like he just said, it's completely stopped. We're in a military coup. The transitional period has stopped. The basics to go into voting or not, you need media, you need rules, you need certain institutions to be put in place. They're all not there. So we cannot actually act like we can go into democracy. We need the transitional period. We need a real transitional period, not like what happened before. And we don't have that right now. So right now we're back into a state of revolution. And I feel like what is really amazing over a year into it is the maturity level of the resistance committees And right now, I think in the street, the consciousness of people in the street has reached a level where they realize that the first step into democracy is to have a parliament, and to have a parliament that is a representative parliament that's real. And this is what we didn't have during the time of Hamdok. And what we want to start with is not a prime minister, is a parliament that then can institute a prime minister, then we can move forward and reach the basis where you can have a democracy to come into state. One thing I want to correct, the resistance committees are never going to go into power. That's not the aim of the resistance committees. What the resistance committees want to do is they want to oversee the creation of a parliament that starts on the grassroots level, local parliaments that then end up into a national government. And this is what is being...
Baghni Eljak Al-Mehdi, do you see a parliament based from the grassroots, growing from the grassroots level, as a realistic, immediate prospect for Sudan?
I don't think so. I think the issues in Sudan are rather really complex, and I think I'm speaking here from a complete developed proposal. I think if the country has a chance to stay unified and avoid going into chaos and rather civil war, there have to be a serious commitment to dialogue that would bring pro-democracy group as a fundamental group that's speaking to the dreams and aspirations of Sudanese people. But at the same time, if we don't reach enough consensus to provide legitimacy for some type of authority to put the foundation for transitional government, I don't think we're going to get out of here. I think the idea of assuming that resistance committees are a unified body, and I've written a paper on resistance committees, and I think what the media says about resistance committees is very far from what the reality is. I understand that they might think that there is specific bodies that speak for resistance committees, but these are not unified bodies. These are not really, there is an idea, but it's far from saying that, and I don't even know, based on what mechanisms and means we can actually get to talk to Sudanese people to build a parliament. That's an aspiration, but I think it could be one of the steps in this broader dialogue that would bring in different political actors. And the revolution is not just resistance committees, they are political parties, they are syndicates, they are professional associations. And to do the right thing is to figure out a way, how do we create a legitimate group that has the representation of Sudanese people. That is something we have to be.
I'm just going to jump in there to give the last word very briefly to Abdul Khalik. What needs to happen immediately to stop this instability in Blue Nile State, in West Kordofan, spreading throughout Sudan?
I think what you need to look at is basically you need a genuine political process in the country, and that political process, once it's in there in Khartoum, it will make things easier for the tribal violence to stop in the region. Otherwise, tribal communities will have to take a side based on the political competitions between which is basically apparent and evident in Khartoum. Unless we reach into to this competition, we're going to see more of this conflict. We've seen it in July, and now it's erupting again in September and October.
Okay, apologies, gentlemen. We will have to leave the discussion there. Hajooj Kuka, Abdul Khalik Shaib, and Baghni Eljak Al-Mehdi, thank you all very much for taking the time to join us on Inside Story. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, it's bye for now.
I've lived in Qatar for 16 years. In 2010, I was live on air in the old souk in Doha when the World Cup announcement was made. It's just really great to have the first Middle East World Cup here. It unites people from different backgrounds and races, and that's why it's so important. And I'm excited that it's finally on my doorstep in Qatar. This is going to be an amazing venue for the World Cup. Can't wait to bring my kids here. Kickoff is just around the corner, and I think we're going to get some really great games.
Indonesia Indonesia, your investment destination, the world's 10th largest economy, is busy transforming, ready to be your business partner. With a robust talent pool, politically and economically stable and strong policies, being the powerhouse, Indonesia is confirmed by the G20 presidency, bringing opportunities for you. Invest Indonesia now.
Witness inspiring films from around the world.
They shall not stop the violence until the power is theirs.
Witness intimate portraits and epic struggles.
Because the leadership is also traumatized. It's not just the people.
Witness the human spirit and bitter reality.
There are still men who believe women are a property.
Witness award-winning voices telling groundbreaking stories. Witness on Al Jazeera.
Talk to Al Jazeera. We ask.
Do you believe that women of Afghanistan were somehow abandoned by the international community?
We listen.
We are paying a huge price for the war against terrorism that's going on in Somalia.
We meet with global newsmakers and talk about the stories that matter on Al Jazeera.
The British-Iraqi journalist who's visualizing complex statistics in a simple art form.
I think it offers us some really exciting opportunities to break apart from those systems of power and to collect data in a way that better represents different communities.
Challenging mainstream misconceptions.
I hope that by creating hand-drawn illustrations, it doesn't alienate people, it doesn't make people feel like I'm not smart enough to understand this.
Whose truth is it anyway? On Al Jazeera.
Palestinians mourn the deaths of 6 people killed by Israeli forces. A prominent leader of the Lion's Den armed group is among the dead. I'm Rob Matheson. This is Al Jazeera live from Doha. Also coming up, Rishi Sunak is set to take over as Britain's youngest Prime Minister after the current leader, Liz Truss, steps down in the next few hours. A powerful cyclone hits Bangladesh, killing at least 9 people and destroying homes. And Qatar is pledging to host the first carbon-neutral Football World Cup. We're going to take a look at the challenges facing the tiny Gulf nation. Six Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces in the occupied West Bank. The Israeli military entered Nablus on Monday night, sparking protests. At least 5 people were killed in the city. Another was killed near Ramallah. Among the dead is a prominent leader of the armed group called the Lion's Den. It's claimed responsibility for a number of recent attacks on illegal settlements and military checkpoints in the West Bank. Nida Ibrahim has more from Khawara in the occupied West Bank.
We know that a special Israeli force has entered Nablus in the early hours of the morning after midnight, and there has been an armed confrontation between that special Israeli force and members of security forces from the Palestinian Authority, leading to more reinforcements from the Israeli side to the city. And we know that there was an attack against an Israeli raid against one car. We're still getting the details of what happened, but it ended up killing 3 Palestinians and injuring more. In the end, Palestinians they managed to evacuate some of those who were stuck in the old city in Nablus, and the result is that 6 Palestinians were killed, including Wadia Al-Hawah, who is a leader in the Lion's Den group. This group has been becoming more and more prominent in the occupied West Bank. People have been praising members of the group for being courageous, for fighting the Israeli occupation. And we've seen scenes where Palestinians were trying to bring the body of Al-Hawah from the hospital, hoping that he was still alive. They were celebrating. And moments later, he was announced dead. We're expecting 6 funerals. This is a tense situation in the occupied West Bank. And people say that because Israel is heading towards an election and there is a leader now in the office, Yair Lapid, the current prime minister, who doesn't have a lot of military experience in the West Bank. So the feeling here amongst Palestinians is that he's trying to win more votes by cracking down heavily on Palestinians.
Okay, let's take a closer look at what we know about Lion's Den. Members of the armed group first appeared in public in Nablus in the occupied West Bank last month. They recited what they called a charter of resistance during a memorial service for 2 Palestinians killed by Israeli forces. Since then, the Lion's Den has claimed responsibility for a number of attacks on military checkpoints and illegal settlements in Nablus. Ibrahim Yunus is media coordinator for the Palestinian Youth Movement. He says Lion's Den armed group has emerged in response to Israeli attacks against young Palestinians.
To understand the perspective of Palestinian youth in the West Bank, you have to look at a situation where there's 800,000 settlers who are illegally occupying a great percentage of the land there. You have constant daily attacks on Palestinian youth who are, whether they're crossing checkpoints, whether they're walking to school or to work. The number of young Palestinians run over by cars or attacked by settlers is large. So obviously there's going to be a lot of popularity among youth in the West Bank when a group says that they're not going to accept the presence of these settlers on their land. They emerged out of a group of youth who defend the city, essentially, from Israeli incursions, and decided to create a more formal group that would defend the city, which is where the group name and organizational structure sort of emerged. They do not have a working relationship with the Palestinian Authority. So the Palestinian Authority at the higher levels collaborates with or coordinates security with Israel, and the Lion's Den does not. So they do not have a formal relationship.
Britain is set to get its youngest prime minister in modern history and the first of Asian heritage. Rishi Sunak is going to succeed Liz Truss as leader in the coming hours. Sunak lost to Truss during the summer in a race to become the Conservative Party leader. But after her resignation last week, Sunak was the only candidate to pass the threshold of 100 votes in a ballot of Conservative MPs. Well, Andrew Simmons is in London and he's joining us now. Andrew, these things are very often carefully choreographed. Just tell us what's going to be happening in the next few hours.
Well, steeped in tradition and carefully choreographed, as you say, and a process that's getting familiar to the British public because this is the third Prime Minister in a matter of 50 days. What we'll see first is a cabinet meeting. We've seen some arrivals already. James Cleverly, the Foreign Minister, and also Ben Wallace, the Defence Minister, just got in, saying absolutely nothing. They're all gathering for that final address from Liz Truss, her shortest term in British history as a Prime Minister. What will she say? It's not known. It'll be brief, one would think, and there would be a pretty tame and a sad atmosphere around that table, I would think. People wondering whether or not they're going to be in the lineup for the new Rishi Sunak cabinet, which we'll know about possibly later on Tuesday. But the next process will be within the hour, an address here in Downing Street at the lectern by Liz Truss. Then she'll go straight to Buckingham Palace and tender her resignation to King Charles III. After that, Rishi Sunak will arrive at Buckingham Palace and be invited by the King to form a government. Then back to Downing Street. He will then, for the first time, really lay out what he plans to do with this crisis-ridden country and what he'll try and do to actually retain or regain some popularity with the British public, because the actual reputation of the Conservative Party has been shattered by recent events, and its popularity is at an all-time recent low in the eyes of everybody in the country because of the state of the economy that's just been pummeled by the policies of Liz Truss.
Yeah, and as you say, Andrew, the pressure is really going to be on Rishi Sunak to start delivering some sort of answer to how he is going to be able to deal with the economy. We're talking about people who can't afford to pay for groceries. We're talking about people who are struggling to find jobs and pay their rent.
Yes, his coming to power coincides with a grim report just out from the Office of National Statistics, which has looked at the year and seen, gone through all the statistics on inflation, and a 14.5% increase, average increase on food, which one highlight to that is that the lowest priced goods, the lowest priced groceries, staple foods, 17% increases. That's really hit the poor more than anyone else, exacerbated the problems for disabled, the vulnerable, and in particular, the figures for ethnic minorities are really high in terms of people struggling to get by. How will he address all of this? Well, he'll hit the ground running with statements on finances. Jeremy Hunt, the finance minister for Liz Truss, turned around all of Truss's attempts to cut tax. And he also brought in a whole raft of measures and invited all departments to cut back on budgets. Now, whether or not the new Prime Minister will want to go further is unclear, but he'll certainly want to put his fingerprints on the fiscal budget, which will be supposed to be announced on the 31st, next Monday. He may go for more time and get the verification from the Office of Budget Responsibility through as well. But highlights for this man, youngest Prime Minister since the 18th century, the first British Asian. There are many aspects to this young Prime Minister that show that he is energetic and will want to get more popularity as quickly as possible. But there's so much he's up against that it couldn't be a worse time to be the Prime Minister of Britain than now.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed. We're going to be checking in with you, of course, as things progress over the next few hours. But for now, Andrew Simmons in London, thank you very much indeed. Okay, let me bring you some breaking news. Messaging service WhatsApp is apparently facing a major outage across the world. Thousands of users are said to be reporting problems. WhatsApp is used by 2 billion people globally. It's owned by Meta, the US headquartered company that also owns Facebook and Instagram. The company's not yet said what's causing the disruption. Cyclone Sitrang has made landfall in Bangladesh, bringing high winds and heavy storm surges. At least 9 people have been killed. Officials fear the toll is going to rise after it hit the low-lying and densely populated coastline of Chittagong Barisal. Hundreds of thousands of people have been evacuated from large cities, including Dhaka. Tanvir Chowdhury has more from Bangladesh's Barisal district.
We are located about 30 kilometers from the coastline. This is Barisal district, southwest Bangladesh. These are the area which got main thrust of the cyclone. Now, while coming here from the Dhaka city, we see a lot of fallen trees. Not much damage compared to what was expected. I spoke to a lot of our contacts in different coastal areas. They said there's been a tidal surge. A lot of the places were inundated. A lot of farmland got destroyed. Fisheries got destroyed. But as far as damage to the homes were minimum, government were successfully able to evacuate nearly 700,000 people since last evening in the cyclone shelter. So the damage was minimum. As you said, there was, so far what we know is 9 people were killed. That's what the local media is also reported. Now the damage assessment report will take time to reach to the media as well as other people, because the communication is very badly disrupted. There's no electricity in the entire southwest belt, even in this Barisal city. We've been talking to people. They said we didn't have electricity since yesterday evening. This comes in a time when there is an energy crisis here. Electricity goes off for 6 hours to 8 hours a day in some parts of the country. So the internet and communication is badly disrupted. Even the mobile telephone system is badly disrupted. So it will take some time to know the exact damage. We know that it hit the coastline at 80 kilometers an hour. So there probably is in the remote islands and other coastal belt, we'll hear for more damage. What's more important to know that usually after the cyclone, it's the crops, the fisheries, the livestock that are the biggest problem that the farmers lose, and it takes years, to recover from this.
Okay, I want to take you to our story from Nablus. These 6 Palestinians have been killed, 21 have been wounded after Israeli forces raided several areas in the occupied West Bank. Israel said it launched an operation against the Palestinian armed group, the Lion's Den. These live pictures, now I want to take you to Nida Ibrahim, our correspondent there. And Nida, I understand it's very noisy where you are. Are you able to tell us what is going on?
We are here in Nablus now, where the funeral procession has started. As you can hear behind me, the sound of gunshots, very loud. Armed men are shooting in the air, mourning the death of 6 Palestinians since the beginning of the year. Throughout all the tension that we've been covering here in the occupied West Bank, we haven't had one day that we've seen 6 Palestinians killed in one day. 5 of them are here in Nablus. And as you can see, the procession is going on. We're seeing people carrying the Palestinians who were killed. One of them is Wadi' al-Hawah. He is very prominent here in Nablus, known as one of the leaders of the Lion's Den group. This group has been gaining a lot of popularity lately because Palestinians say that it is defying Israel, that it's conducting shooting attacks and conducting attacks that have led to the killing of Israeli soldiers. This is why Israel has been cracking down on this group of Palestinians. They are belonging to different Palestinian factions. They're mobilized by themselves. And we've been hearing in the past few weeks that there were efforts by the Palestinian Authority to try and convince some of the armed men in Nablus to hand over their weapons and to be engaged in the Palestinian security forces ranks. People here were saying that Wadi' al-Hawah, one of those who were killed, has refused to hand over his weapon. And there has been a state of support. There has been a wave of support for these Palestinians who are taking up arms and fighting the Israeli occupation. Last night, the Special Israeli Forces unit has raided Nablus, and they've also clashed with security forces from the Palestinian Authority. This is something we don't usually see, and we've heard from a senior Fatah leader, Mahmoud al-Alul, saying that this shows that there's a state of unity between the Palestinians in the security forces of the Palestinian Authority and elsewhere in the occupied West Bank. Remember, it's been a deadly year here in the West Bank. More than 131 Palestinians were killed just in the occupied West Bank itself by Israeli forces, including our own Al Jazeera's prominent journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, who was targeted and shot dead in Jenin by Israeli forces. So we're looking at a very tense situation, one of the deadliest years in so long. And we're seeing now the tension rising, some of the armed men taking to the streets. They're being hailed by people here as heroes. We've seen just a couple of days ago a Palestinian shooter who managed to do 2 shooting attacks, not one, and then he was killed in the second shooting attack. So these kinds of attacks have mobilized Palestinians, have gathered a wave of support for these military activities. And let's not forget that in the beginning of November, there is the Israeli elections, and there is a current prime minister who doesn't have a military experience. So people here say that he's trying to show force, he's trying to conduct these heavy crackdowns on Palestinian armed men to gain popularity and to get more votes. The result, as we're seeing, is that Palestinians say they're going to keep defying, they're going to keep fighting, because they say this is the only way for them to get rid of decades-long Israeli military occupation.
Nida, thank you very much indeed. We're going to be following you as these funerals continue over the next few hours. But for now, thank you very much indeed. Let's get Israel's reaction on this. We're going to speak to Bernard Smith, who's in West Jerusalem for us. Bernard, the Lion's Den has claimed responsibility for a number of attacks on military checkpoints and illegal settlements. How is Israel approaching all of this?
Well, the Israeli government says the Prime Minister Yair Lapid and the Defense Minister Benny Gantz watched this operation unfold overnight from the Military and Security Services headquarters in Tel Aviv. Israel's Prime Minister said that no Israeli troops were injured and that they are doing everything they say to secure the security of Israelis living in Israel and in the settlements. It has to be said that it's believed that the reason the Israeli military and the security services are concerned about Lion's Den particularly is because it's a new group that has emerged. It's non-factional, it's believed to be secular, and the belief is that the Israeli military is trying to sort of nip this group in the bud. Nablus has been surrounded, as we know, has been blockaded for the last couple of weeks. 170,000 people living there, as Nida has been explaining to you. But the Israelis say that, in fact, we understand that the operation carried out overnight was carried out under cover of darkness, but they were spotted by Palestinian security forces and by these militants, these fighters from Lion's Den, which resulted in this larger gun battle. Now, the Israeli group says they believe that Lion's Den has been responsible for a series of attacks in recent months. That is why it's gone after this group. The Prime Minister on radio, he said that they've been working for several days on this operation. This is a complex operation, and the goal is to prevent terrorism inside Israel.
Bernard, thank you very much indeed. That's Bernard Smith talking to us from West Jerusalem. Germany is hosting a conference on rebuilding Ukraine after Russia's invasion. The president of the EU Commission said Russia's attacks on infrastructure are pure acts of terrorism. It's estimated it'll cost at least $200 billion to fix Ukraine's infrastructure. In the early days of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Irpin became a symbol of resistance. Now, as Mohammed Jamjoom reports, reconstruction efforts are underway to bring life back to the heavily damaged city.
Here in Irpin, which sits just outside Kyiv and stands as a symbol of Ukrainian resistance, you can still very clearly see the massive levels of devastation that this war has brought upon this country. It's been months since Russian forces withdrew from this city, and yet apartment complexes like this one still lie in ruin. That's because government money is largely going to the military right now. And it's also why residents' associations here are putting up signs on the sides of buildings asking for donations and providing bank details for those who wish to donate.
If we find funding by spring or summer, we could begin rebuilding our house, and by 2024 we would likely come back here to live.
The cost of repairing the damage to Ukraine's infrastructure has been estimated by the Kyiv School of Economics to be nearly $200 billion. Now, local officials here and throughout the country have been appealing to the international community for help in their reconstruction efforts. Here in Irpin, people are still living in less damaged buildings like this one. In this city, there were more than 1,000 buildings that were damaged and more than 100 that were destroyed completely as a result of the fighting.
We come back because we wanted to be in our home. Thanks to the authorities, we are slowly getting prepared, and we're trying to live, and we hope everything will be rebuilt soon.
There is a problem. We don't have enough building materials needed to finish the work. That's why we're asking charitable organizations for more help and supplies.
Many throughout Ukraine are doing all they can to aid in the reconstruction effort. But with winter fast approaching, temperatures dropping, and Russia targeting more and more of the country's power grid, Ukrainians are growing ever more concerned.
Well, Harry Foss is joining us live now from Kyiv. I understand that Volodymyr Zelensky has been talking to the reconstruction conference that's been going on. Do we know what he's been saying?
Yes, he's been speaking via video link in now pretty familiar and pretty blunt terms about the plight being faced by his country and the need for the international community, as far as he's concerned, to do more. He said that of the immediate, fast $17 billion fund required for reconstruction this year and next, he said that not a cent of that had yet come through. He talked about the massive hole in Ukraine's government finances, $38 billion. He said, we know that the economy here has taken a hit in terms of some 30% of GDP being sliced off the economy by Russia's invasion and the damage and destruction that is eventuated from it, the flight of people from the country and the impact, of course, on industry here. And when it comes to the relentless attacks that have been coming in the last couple of weeks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, again, talking about 33% of these vital energy infrastructure nodes being damaged or destroyed in the course of that. We also heard on Monday from his prime minister, Ukraine's prime minister, saying that in total, $750 billion will be required in terms of trying to rebuild Ukraine. That's a number that could, of course, inflate still further the longer this war goes on. And there will be difficult choices to be made in terms of exactly how to do that, where to spend that money, whether it's just in reconstructing what was destroyed or coming up with more modern ways of doing industry and business in this country, potentially a longer term and more difficult process than just putting back together what's been taken apart.
Yeah, Harry, we're also hearing that the UN's nuclear watchdog is going to be sending inspectors to Ukraine, and that's because Russia has been accusing Ukraine of planning to use what's known as a dirty bomb, that's explosives laced with nuclear material. What more do we know about what this visit's going to entail?
Well, we know that it's going to happen in the next few days, according to the head of the IAEA. It's something that the Ukrainians themselves are calling for. They have been utterly denying, saying that these claims are absurd and dangerous, and that they have no such plans to concoct some kind of dirty bomb in Ukraine and blame it on Russia. That's the accusation that's coming from the Russian side. And so, yes, they've invited these inspectors in. The Russians are saying that there are two nuclear institutions within Ukraine that have been given the task of coming up with this bomb and that it's in its final stages. The IAEA is saying that they inspected one of these two places just a month ago and found nothing untoward going on, and that they are going to send in inspectors into both of them. I spoke to a senior defense analyst just yesterday evening about this situation, a senior member of the National Institute for Strategic Studies, Security Studies rather, and he was saying that there is the potential for potentially Russia to do something like this by using spent fuel from the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which it controls, but there are IAEA staff there as well. He said that this was more about rhetoric and trying to show that Russia was unbowed and willing to escalate further, that despite the recent defeats on the battlefield, it was willing to carry on fighting.
Harry, thank you very much indeed. Harry Fawcett talking to us from Kyiv. The US Justice Department says it's charged two suspected Chinese intelligence officers. Washington says they were involved in an alleged plot to disrupt a federal probe into the Chinese tech giant Huawei. The Justice Department separately announced charges against 4 other Chinese nationals. It's accusing them of trying to get hold of sensitive technology using the cover of an academic institute. Heidi Jo Castro has got more from Washington, D.C.
These two Chinese agents tried to bribe a U.S. law enforcement official into giving up sensitive and secret documents regarding the U.S.'s legal strategy in its prosecution of Huawei, but that in fact this U.S. government official was a double agent who was working under the direction of FBI and feeding these alleged Chinese spies fake documents. There were also other cases they mentioned, another case in New Jersey where 7 Chinese nationals were charged with trying to forcibly repatriate and harass a naturalized U.S. citizen into returning to China. 2 of those that have been charged in that case have been arrested. But a big question is how the U.S. will arrest the remaining individuals who were charged if they are no longer in the U.S. or have been conducting this from China this whole time. Bigger picture here now. Again, I said that this was announced by the 2 top law enforcement officers in the U.S., the FBI director and the attorney general. And they had strong words about what they call the backdrop of malign activity from China, described as espionage, harassment, obstruction of justice, and the stealing of technology.
More than 1 million football fans are preparing for their trip to Qatar, with the World Cup just 26 days away. The environmental impact of that many travellers will be huge, but organisers are confident of delivering the first carbon-neutral tournament. Natasha Kanaim reports.
Carbon dioxide, or CO2 emissions, soared to a record level last year. By several indexes, Qatar ranks high globally when it comes to CO2 emissions per capita. This November, the Gulf nation is pledging to host the first ever carbon-neutral World Cup.
A lot of people will come to the Qatar by air, but the activities here within Qatar is designed in such a way that all the emissions associated, there will be limited emissions, and these emissions will be balanced.
The layout of stadiums over a small geographic area means once fans land in Qatar, they'll travel a relatively short distance by metro, electric bus, or car to matches in stadiums built with sustainability in mind. After football's premier spectacle is over, the CO2 emissions during the 28 days will be offset by investing in carbon credits. But a report by Carbon Market Watch says Qatar 2022's carbon-neutral plan is misleading and based on what it calls creative calculations.
It is highly unlikely that this World Cup is going to be carbon neutral. It is not a credible claim, and there is a big risk that it's going to mislead the public into thinking that this has no impact on the climate when actually it definitely does.
The organizing committee says Qatar's historic ambitions should be recognized, not criticized. It points to the almost 1 million square meters of green space created and a new solar power plant that will generate renewable energy for years after the tournament ends.
We stand by our planning, we stand by our calculations, and we stand by our plans to offset what's remaining in the best possible way with the best information that we have.
A team from Qatar University will be setting up weather monitoring stations and sharing the daily air quality with fans during the World Cup. The hope is it will spread awareness about the impact we have on the climate and how to reduce our carbon footprint. Natasha Ghanem, Al Jazeera, Doha.
This is Al Jazeera. These are the top stories. In breaking news, messaging service WhatsApp's facing a major outage around the world. WhatsApp is used by 2 billion people. The company hasn't said what's causing the disruption. At least 6 Palestinians have been killed and 21 wounded after Israeli forces raided several areas in the occupied West Bank. Israel said it launched an operation against the Palestinian armed group Lion's Den. Nida Ibrahim's got more from Nablus.
We are here in Nablus now, where the funeral procession has started. As you can hear behind me, the sound of gunshots, very, very loud. Armed men are shooting in the air, mourning the death of 6 Palestinians since the beginning of the year. Throughout all the tension that we've been covering here in the occupied West Bank, we haven't had one day that we've seen 6 Palestinians killed in one day. 5 of them are here in Nablus.
Rishi Sunak is set to officially succeed Liz Truss as the UK's Prime Minister in the coming hours. At the age of 42, Sunak's going to become the youngest British leader in modern history. Cyclone Sitrang has made landfall in Bangladesh, bringing high winds and heavy storm surges. At least 9 people have been killed, and officials fear the toll is going to rise. Germany's hosting a conference on rebuilding Ukraine after Russia's invasion. The president of the EU Commission said Russia's attacks on infrastructure are pure acts of terrorism. Those are the headlines. The news continues here on Al Jazeera after the stream. Goodbye for now.
Talk to Al Jazeera. We ask.
Do you believe that women of Afghanistan was somehow abandoned by the international community?
We listen.
We are paying a huge price for the war against terrorism that's going on in Somalia.
We meet with global newsmakers and talk about the stories that matter on Al Jazeera.
Hi, I'm Femi Oke, and you're watching The Stream. Will the Parthenon marbles ever return to Greece? This is a question that's been going on for a very long time. The original sculptures were removed from Athens in the early 19th century by Lord Elgin, the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. Greece wants her national treasures back. Currently housed in the British Museum in London, as you can see here, what will it take for the Parthenon marbles to go home? You can join this discussion. It's been going on for 200 years at least. You can jump on here into the comment section, be part of today's show.
As a student of classics in the 1970s, I believe that there were good reasons for keeping the Parthenon sculptures in England. First, they were an integral and legally acquired part of the British Museum's collection. Secondly, they were safer in London than in traffic-plagued Athens. And thirdly, returning them would set a terrible precedent for the return of other items. Now I'm a classics professor, and I know that all those arguments are invalid or untrue. Very few objects of such iconic status. If they do, they too should be returned. The time's overdue for the British Museum to create its own display of the Parthenon frieze in full colour and to repatriate the original marbles to their home in Athens.
Talking about the Parthenon sculptures in the British Museum, Yanis, Tristram, Ellie, so good to have all three of you here on the show. Yanis, please say hello to our audience around the world. Tell them who you are, what you do.
Hello, Femi. Hello, everyone. My name is Yanis Andritzopoulos. I think that you didn't want to pronounce my name because you scared that you would mispronounce it.
I am fearless, Yanis. I am fearless. Don't test me.
Well, so I will test you in the course of this discussion. So sure. I'm the London correspondent for a Greek daily newspaper called Tanea. I've been based in London for almost 7 years, and as you can imagine, I've been covering the Parthenon marbles a lot.
Oh my goodness, of course I can imagine, totally. Tristram, so nice to have you. Please introduce yourself to our audience around the world. Tell them who you are and what you do briefly.
Hello, Femi. Lovely to be here with you. I'm Tristram Besterman. I'm a retired UK museum director who is guilty of returning material in our collections to the source community. And I'm now a freelance advisor and help other museums to do the same.
Such a troublemaker, Tristram. Good to have you. Ellie, welcome to the show. Please tell our audience who you are and what you do briefly.
Hello, everyone. It's lovely to be here. My name's Ellie Simons, and I'm the Vice President of the Australian Parthenon Committee and co-founder of the Acropolis Research Group. And we have been, well, many in our committee have been active on the campaign for 20 to 25 years. I've been in the campaign for 10 years, and I'm just very passionate about this issue.
So we asked the British Museum to be part of this conversation, and as they typically do, they sent a statement rather than a person. This is what they said to us. We will loan the sculptures, as we do many other objects, to those who wish to display them to the public around the world, provided they will look after them and return them. Ellie?
Yes. You'd like me to comment on that?
Please, take the filter off.
Well, what they failed to say in that sentence is that they require anyone loaning to sign a waiver, an ownership waiver, which of course the Hellenic government is, unable to do. It's just not possible for them to sign an ownership waiver. So that's why it's not possible for them to be loaned to Greece, given they had been loaned to the Hermitage Museum in Russia. One pediment piece was several years ago. But yes, it's this ownership waiver which the Hellenic government will not sign.
Tristram, I'm just amazed that we're even having a discussion about this. There is no debate anymore, is there? Is it even possible to be neutral on the Parthenon sculptures and where they should truly be housed?
Well, I'm professionally as well as personally embarrassed that the British Museum consistently refuses to enter into a constructive public dialogue. There has been a sea change in museums right across the UK over the last 20 years or so, and the focus has moved away from sort of ownership of stuff to how does the museum and what it holds relate to people, to communities, either the communities who live around the museum or the communities from which the material came. It's all about conversations. It's all about giving people a voice. And it embarrasses me that the British Museum is so far behind the curve in having that kind of constructive dialogue. Because having led it myself in Manchester, where we had big diaspora communities from all over the world, but particularly from Africa, what happens is when you give them a voice and empower them in the museum starts to sprout wings, and we learn so much more, and the people who use the museum hear other voices. It becomes a more vibrant, interesting, and exciting place. Everybody wins. So the idea that you've got this museum sitting in the middle of Bloomsbury that holds so much material from all around the world, but we're here specifically to talk about the Parthenon sculptures, refuses to have that conversation, and I can explain in a moment why that is a matter of professional embarrassment.
Let me just tap into our audience who are watching right now, Yanis. This is Tom. Tom Flynn says, loan them. How do you loan stolen goods to their rightful owners? Yanis.
Well, that's a good point, and that's precisely why the Greek government consistently has refused to contemplate a loan solution. Greece wants the marbles back to be reunited in Athens with the rest of the marbles permanently, not as a loan. And I'm slightly optimistic that we will get there in the near future.
Why are you optimistic?
Well, I don't know if there is yet a shift in the British Museum stance. What I can see for sure is a change of language. Let me remind everyone that the chair of the trustees of the British Museum, George Osborne, said a couple of months ago that there is a deal to be done. So let's build on that statement and try to reach a deal with the British Museum.
All right. Ellie, what is it like as somebody who's Greek to have your treasures in a British museum? What does that feel like?
Well, look, I think this is a twofold thing. There are Hellenes, like myself, in the Greek diaspora, and also Philhellenes. And so I don't think you can differentiate. I think Philhellenes feel as strongly about this issue as Hellenes. But as a Hellene, I can say that it, as the famous Melina Mercouri said, you know, they are our heart, they're our soul, they're our passion. I mean, we are very aware that we have a very long history. They were carved and created here 2,500 years ago in Athens, and we as Greeks feel very strongly that they should be reunited. Not just they need to be reunited as part of the building, and they can't be on the building, but the next best thing, of course, is the Acropolis Museum, to be as one artwork. And I think Philhellenes around the world agree with that.
Can you tell people who are not Hellenes what an Hellene is?
Well, a Hellene, I guess, is someone that identifies as being Greek, of Greek parents and ancestry, Greek parents and grandparents.
So the Acropolis Museum was built because the British Museum said, well, in Athens, you don't have anywhere suitable to put your own treasures in. So then the Greeks built this incredibly beautiful museum, and then the British Museum still didn't give the treasures back, Tristram, because of 2 acts, which forbid the British Museum to give away what's in the museum that they probably looted or stole or acquired in unethical ways. Tristram.
Well, I do want to pay tribute to Greece for building such a beautiful museum. It is absolutely stunning.
Yeah.
And the very top floor is like a great big glass case that looks across the valley to the Acropolis, and you can see the Parthenon with, as you walk around the sculptures. But just to go back to the point that Ellie was making, and connect it with what I was saying about relationships. In this dysfunctional relationship between Britain and Greece, there are 3 players. There's the Greek government, there's the British Museum, and there is the British government. And the reason that the 2 national governments are so important is that by statute that was passed in 1963, the British Museum is not allowed to divest itself of certain things, of anything in the collection, unless it meets certain conditions. And that's why we have this merry-go-round of the British Museum saying, we can't discuss it because we're forbidden from parting with this material by Act of Parliament. And Parliament says, we can't discuss it because it's British Museum business. So you go round and round in a wonderful circle.
It's deliberate. Tristram, surely that's got to be deliberate. It's, Yanis, you go ahead. It's a built-in safety net, so you don't have to return the Parthenon sculptures.
It's a wall.
It's a law. It's a law.
Exactly.
Yanis,
and if you let me add, what Tristram just described is what we call in Greece a game of ping pong between the British Museum and the British government, because the British Museum says that because of the British Museum Act, we cannot give you the marbles back. And on the other hand, the British government says the British Museum is the owner of the marbles. Don't talk to me, talk to the museum. And while this is technically true, Femi, it is in fact the British government that could introduce the necessary legislation to allow the sculptures returned to Greece. But it simply does not want to do it, at least not for the time being. I'm optimistic that this will change in the future.
Look, I have to show you some headlines, Tristram. First of all, you go first, Tristram. I'll go second with my headlines. Go ahead.
Well, thank you. I just wanted to say that there is good reason for Yanis's optimism, because there is precedent. When Parliament sees something that is clearly not right and unjust, it has intervened in the past. In 2004, there was an act of Parliament in which museums were added, which allowed them and enabled them to give back human tissue, human remains, bones, skulls, to source communities, because Parliament regarded this as completely unjust, that source communities should not be able to reclaim their ancestors. So there's a precedent there. That was in 2004. In 2009, we had a big scandal about Nazi spoliated art that was in the British Museum and in other museums. And again, material which had been stolen by the Nazis and ended up in our national collections was subject to enabling legislation which allowed this to be returned. So there is good precedent for Parliament stepping in, doing the right thing when the right thing needs to be done.
Yes, talking about Parliament, I was just curious about how many British Prime Ministers have said, we cannot possibly return. It's interesting that we call them the Parthenon sculptures rather than the Elgin marbles. I think that shows a little bit of a public opinion change here. But I wanted to go back a few years. I went back to 1999. Have a look here on my laptop for some headlines about the Parthenon sculptures. Blair blocks return of Elgin marbles. David Cameron rejects call to return Parthenon marbles to Greece. We've got one from Boris Johnson, RIP. Boris Johnson says British Museum trustees must decide fate of Parthenon marbles, kicking it over to the British Museum. And then one more from the very short-lived UK Prime Minister, Liz Truss, says she does not support repatriating the Parthenon marbles to Greece. So Prime Ministers, doesn't really matter who they are or even what party they're in, Yanis, they don't seem to be behind the idea of these Parthenon sculptures going back to Athens. Are you getting something different from the British public, though?
Yeah, of course, because first of all, let me remind everyone that the extract you just read from Boris Johnson, Johnson as a Prime Minister said that to me in an exclusive interview with Tanea a year ago. But we also revealed last summer that when Boris Johnson was an undergraduate in Oxford University, he had said exactly the opposite, that the marbles belonged to Greece. And actually he provided proof that says that Lord Elgin had stolen the marbles. So I think that does make sense. I mean, his current position. But yes, because you mentioned the British public, there are there's a series of opinion polls. So the latest one was released a few days ago that says that overwhelmingly the British public supports the reunification of the Parthenon marbles.
There's a broader conversation to be had, not just about the Parthenon sculptures or the Elgin marbles, however you want to call them, but what it really means to have art from another culture and another country shut up in a different museum on the other side of the world. Here's Georgia Garvey. This is what she told us a few hours ago.
In a broader sense, proud of the contribution of the ancient Greeks, but most relevant, the marbles are a symbol of the thousands of similar items in museums in the UK, in Germany, in France, items that in many cases were acquired through questionable methods. And as to whether they should be returned, it's not a matter of if, but when. Obviously, the British Museum is worried about opening the floodgates, and they should be. Items from Egypt, India, Nigeria, we should be having conversations about returning all of the ill-gotten artifacts to their home countries.
What is so bad about art going back to the country of its birth, the country and the countrymen and women who created it, Ellie? Why is that a disaster?
Well, it's not a disaster. I mean, look, I suppose it depends on the perspective. If the item that you're talking about is a pivotal piece of a nation, a culture's history, then of course it's important. If it's a sculpture or a piece of work that has other instances or is quite similar or is part of an assemblage that is, it is more common, then of course it's great for that culture to have. Could argue, I mean, that's what the purpose of a universal museum is, to exhibit wonderful things from heritage all over the world, and they are great repositories. We all love these museums, but there are just simply some artefacts, some pieces that are unique, like the Parthenon sculptures, and this is the case that we make. They are unique. There is nothing else like them. They are not one single piece of work. It's not. You can't just take a river god from the pediment and say it's a statue. It's not a statue. The whole frieze and the whole pediment of the Parthenon and the metopes, they are one unified monument, as we describe it, and they are, as great Geoffrey Robertson has called it, a showreel of ancient Athens, the mythology, the history of ancient Athens. So you cannot take these pieces out and assemble them, and nor should they be in half. They need to be reunified because, quite simply, it is a unique monument and it is representative of a culture and of a history that goes back such a long way, that the people that created it, and it's just really imperative that it comes together as one.
So Tristram, I'm just looking at a page on the British Museum's website called Contested Objects from the Collection. Let's just take a look here. It's really interesting the way that the British Museum writes about how the Parthenon sculptures ended up in the British Museum. I think it's an interesting narrative that they've chosen to to share with the public, but we have Benin bronzes, we've got human remains, we have an early shield from Australia, Parthenon sculptures. Is it possible that if the Parthenon sculptures go back to Athens, that then the British Museum will begin to lose what they value so much, which is world culture and art, that they feel, and they have actually said to us in a statement, that they can make those connections between art around the world, and the British Museum is the best place to do that?
Well, this is the universalist argument, and it has been made very strongly by various directors of the British Museum. Neil MacGregor was a great ambassador for that idea, but it is largely discredited now. And I wanted to come back on Ellie's point, and just to add to it, I agreed with everything she said, but what makes the Parthenon sculptures so unique is that the building from which they were hacked by the Earl of Elgin, that building still exists. It is there. Yes. And that makes them very, very particular. The only comparative item in the British Museum collection to that would be the beard of the Sphinx, because the Sphinx is still there in the desert of Egypt. But I do want to emphasize the fact that these are a very, very special assemblage of items that, as Ellie says, they were part and parcel of a building. They were part of the structure of the building. And it's not a coincidence that in Greece, these sculptures are referred to as blocks, because they are relief carvings on the blocks that form the part of the structure. Elgin got local stonemasons to saw them off so he could ship them back to Britain. And so they're called slabs in Britain, and that's because they've already been mutilated. And so you can see in their form today their disconnection, really, from that wonderful building, which stands as a monument to classical ideas and principles that echo down the centuries, down the millennia. Okay. And it is a national disgrace that we are still arguing about it.
Can I please give an example of what Tristram is saying right now? Just an example. Think of Athena, the goddess of Athena. Her head and her neck is in the Acropolis Museum, while her right breast remains in the British Museum. Does that make sense to you?
No, nobody wants to have just one breast. All right, Hakeem Bishara. No. If you're a sculpture, I add. Hakeem Bishara told us this a little bit earlier, and I think it really is aimed at the British Museum, who's not in this conversation but been mentioned many, many times. Let's have a listen. Let's have a look.
It's good news that the British Museum is finally willing to talk, but it shouldn't be a negotiation. The idea of a loan, however long-term it is only adding insult to injury. What the British Museum and government should do immediately is first return the sculptures, second, apologize for keeping them for so long, and third, work with Greek scholars and artists on mounting an exhibition at the British Museum that explains how these artifacts were acquired and returned. It's never too late to decolonize.
You know, our audience who are watching right now are asking, where is the British Museum in this conversation? We're talking about them, but they're not here to speak for themselves. I am wondering, Ellie, how long is this conversation, this persuasion going to go on? 1 year, 5 years, 20 years? What do you think?
Well, of course, it's actually been going on for 200 years. I mean, King Otto was the first. They requested it not long after the first Greek state was formed. But I guess the campaign in the last 30, 40 years has really been advocating very strongly. But I think the conversation, as Yanni said at the very beginning, I feel that there is a shift, there is a change. I think the zeitgeist really has changed. And it's picking up momentum. It's wrong on so many levels. And of course, one thing we haven't discussed yet, which I'd like to touch on, is the solution. You know, what is the solution? Yes, they should just give them back, and it should be a political a political will. It should just be a decision that gets made. But then, you know, what can the solution look like?
Yeah. Ellie, can you give me the solution in one sentence? Because we're right at the very end of the show. Your last word is what?
Okay, the solution rests on 3D digital printing of a beautiful set of copies and or a rotating exhibition of wonderful artefacts which the Greek government is prepared to loan and as an exhibition.
Okay, Ellie's got the solution right here. Why have we been discussing this for 200 years? We could have just asked Ellie. Ellie, Tristram and Yanis and all of our viewers who are watching on YouTube and watching around the world, thanks for joining us. I'll see you next time. Take care.
November on Al Jazeera.
As the footballing world's greatest tournament kicks off, all eyes turn to Qatar as it prepares a spectacle like no other.
Old ways for new days. First Nations Frontline discovers how traditional knowledge is helping solve modern problems.
Israel holds its 5th general election in less than 4 years. Will this round draw a line under its political crisis?
Generation Football meets the inspiring players tackling socio-political issues on and off the pitch.
Americans vote in defining midterm elections. The results could see Biden and the Democrats lose their Congress majority.
November on Al Jazeera. Discover a world of difference, determination.
I'm telling you that we winning, we are moving.
Freedom.
We planned an escape as child soldiers, and only 16 people made it.
Corruption and compassion. Al Jazeera World, a selection of the best films from across our network of channels.
What we do in Al Jazeera is try to balance this story and give the people who allow us into their lives dignity and humanity.
A sense of belonging.
You walk down any street in Parkdale and you can feel the presence of the Tibetan community.
And the everyday heroes keeping communities together.
Loga is always Loga.
Al Jazeera visits a Tibetan community in Toronto, Canada, where locals are fighting to maintain their identity in the face of skyrocketing rents and gentrification. A sense of community on Al Jazeera.
Palestinians hold funerals for those killed by Israeli forces in overnight raids, including a leader of the Lion's Den armed group. I'm Rob Matheson. This is Al Jazeera live from Doha. Also coming up, Rishi Sunak is set to take over as Britain's Prime Minister. Liz Truss is going to tender her resignation to the King in the next hour. We're going to be live in London. Meta confirms a global outage for its popular messaging service, WhatsApp, and says it's working to restore it. And a powerful cyclone hits Bangladesh, killing at least 11 people and destroying homes. A funeral procession has been underway for Palestinians killed during an Israeli army raid in the occupied West Bank. The Israeli military entered Nablus on Monday night, sparking protests. At least 5 people were killed in the city. Another was killed near Ramallah. Among the dead is a prominent leader of the armed group called Lion's Den. Well, let's get more on this from our correspondents in the region. In a moment, we're going to hear from Bernard Smith in West Jerusalem. First, we're going to go to Nida Ibrahim in Nablus. Nida, just tell us what's been happening in the last hour or so.
We've been seeing funerals of 5 Palestinians taking place here in the main square in Nablus as they were taken to be laid to rest in the cemeteries in town. Now, the amount of gun shooting that we've witnessed is probably nothing like we've seen, and we've been covering the tension in the occupied West Bank since the beginning of the year. The faces are filled with anger, with frustration. There were chants of people saying that they will continue fighting the decades-long military Israeli occupation. We've also seen people who say... And probably I'm going to ask our cameraman to pan to show you some of gunmen that we've been seeing since the beginning of the day, shooting in the air as a sign of frustration, as a sign of mourning, and as a sign of respect for those who were killed, including Wadi al-Hawah. Palestinians here say that he was an inspirational person, that he was one of the leaders of the Lion group. This group, we've been seeing a lot of support for it among Palestinians here. We're seeing a lot of support amongst Palestinians for these Palestinians who are taking up arms. And we've also heard that there are efforts by the Palestinian Authority to kind of convince some of these men to put on